account manager. I'm here today because I got interested in Bitcoin through my boyfriend, and every month I buy it a little bit more. Cryptocurrency is particularly interesting, and I just want to learn a lot more and learn how I can use it to the best of my ability.
Hi, my name is Wanda Swartz. I'm from Schoeman Law Inc. I'm an attorney, and I'm here to learn about the fantastic entrepreneurs here and a little bit more about Bitcoin.
Hi, I'm Nathan. I'm from a company called Digest. Weekly newsletter aiming to improve financial literacy. It's aimed at people that have no understanding of finance or economics. I really hope to learn some more about the blockchain, underlying technology itself, and what are the applications outside of finance.
Today is really a wonderful Startup Grind event, one of the biggest we've had, and we have the managing partner of Newtown Venture Capital, or Newtown Partners. They are the company that's invested in SAFlorist, in GetWalla, a company that's doing some amazing things in cryptocurrency and blockchain, and he is also the executive director of the Bitcoin Foundation. Okay, and we're super excited to have him here. So please, get up on your feet. Let's make a big round of applause to Llew Claasen. Welcome. Welcome to Startup Grind, Llew.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to this because everybody's here for one thing. They forgot about everything else that you do. So, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're from East London.
I am.
Yes.
Sure. So how does the story start? The story starts, little town, thought I wanted to be an accountant. Quickly realized after studying accounting that wasn't what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. And before we even go to the accounting, which crèche did you attend? Which school did you go to?
So I went to Hudson Park.
Uh-huh.
There are actually a lot of people, strangely enough, who came to went to safe school.
Awesome.
Yeah, and
is it the same primary and secondary?
yeah. I mean, I spent some time in Port Elizabeth as well. So very much an Eastern Cape guy, and as life would have it, I've known Vinnie Lingham since forever, and we went to the same school, and like it's like you know somebody so well that you like had your first cigarette together, then you know. And it's quite weird because we kind of always a number of times now we've ended up getting into business on different things, and I think that the latest venture that we're kind of on is this idea, and it's gone through phases. So that we were there in the dot-com bubble and the bust right at the end. And then we got involved in digital marketing as well when the idea of paid search marketing on the internet was a fairly new concept. Kind of stumbled accidentally into that as well. And the journey that we're on at the moment is which of course I want to talk about, because I'm super excited about it, is the next version of the internet, which is the internet of value, and where Bitcoin fits into that, and how that changes what we think is everything.
And what did you study? If somebody's thinking now that, okay, from East London and you end up being the executive director of the Bitcoin Foundation, what did you study?
So, as I said, I think it was one of those things where I kind of stumbled into my first career. I actually wanted to be a mathematician, strangely enough. Always kind of liked numbers, but I accidentally, ended up getting into the finals of the high school accounting Olympiad in South Africa. And so I happened to be, quite good at accounting as well, and PKF kind of approached me and said to me, we'd like you to join us out of school, and we'll pay for your studies. And so I joined PKF to become an accountant, and I thought I'd enjoy that very much, and I did actually. But what I realized is that I wasn't super excited about driving by looking in the rearview mirror, and I felt like that's kind of what accounting was doing, and I wanted to do something else. And so almost immediately after finishing articles and realizing that I really didn't want to be a CA or an auditor, I kind of started venturing into business intelligence, I guess what you would call big data today, and tried to put together a big data solution for small businesses. Already by then, Vinny and I had invested in a couple of, when I say invested, I mean I use that term loosely, a couple of $100,000, a couple of $1,000 here or there into startups and trying to launch these online e-commerce businesses, and we kind of were very super interested in how to apply, even at that very early stage, how you could apply data to online businesses. I think that we realized that the way that you were going to make money online was if you had a very large audience and you were able to convert them into doing something of value, and that kind of took us to the next major, I guess, journey, which is we started Fix the Customers or Incubator, and I think it's called NMPI now, which at the time it was, and again, it was just good timing, some luck, ability, I guess, to identify that opportunity, and at one point in time, it was the biggest paid search agency in the world. It was a very short time, but nevertheless, I think it was the beginning of an industry. And what's cool about also going through these cycles is that you start to understand that these patterns repeat themselves. And so, having gone through launching a startup before the dot-com bust, and then being still involved in startups after the dot-com bust, which actually didn't affect South Africa that much, and then having that repeat again in digital marketing and being able to identify this idea of sort of early adopters, early majority, late majority, how to get new technology adopted, I think was super helpful the second time around. And I think the second time around we got a lot more ambitious, and we didn't want to solve a local problem. We immediately started targeting international customers. So Fix the Customers for the first 2 years of its life, maybe even the first 3 years of its life, didn't have any South African customers. They were all international. UK, Australia, US. So I think again, we kind of wanted to create, right from the beginning, we wanted to do really big things, and we thought that we had an opportunity. And make no mistake, there were lots of losses along the way. We made lots of mistakes. And I think we still make a lot of mistakes. But the cool thing is that I think that we're getting better at it, so that we have more successes than we have failures. So, that's kind of how we got to where we are today.
And what were some of your biggest mistakes? What did you learn from them?
I guess the first one was...
Okay, what were you thinking about that? Can you hear us okay at the back? Oh, if you can't hear us, then you won't even hear my question, right? You're good? Okay, saying it's not great. Where's the sound guy? Okay, they're struggling to hear us at the back. Okay, what were your...
First major failure?
Yes.
It was physical retail. And to be honest with you, so what happened is there was physical retail stores in malls, and it was food, and we realized very quickly, I realized very quickly that I really didn't ever want to be involved in physical fulfillment ever again. And that's one of the reasons why the startups that we get involved in are almost all software. There is so much less hassle. Those business models are so much more scalable. They're not as capital intensive. Your working capital requirements, you tend to be able to cycle through capital far more quickly. So even so in that particular case, we went through a process of, and I guess the other thing is, in that particular process, we wanted to we had 2 retail outlets. We wanted to expand to 20 or something like that. I think we were 20 at the time. We weren't even really allowed to sign the documents, so there was that added complication. And we ended up going to some other development agency, and they said to us they were going to fund the expansion. And so we made all the classic mistakes of spending the money before you get the money, and then expecting that we would get the money within a reasonable period of time, and not expecting that it would take a year. And so, it was an absolute mess. So I think that then, and that would have been 2000 and, where was that now? 2001, I think we lost then about, I think it was about R1 million on that business. But we lost a lot more money of everybody else's money as well. And another key thing that I learned out of that process is, although I actively encourage people to go to friends, family, fools first for money, make no mistake that family will haunt you if you lose their money.
Yes. Cool. I'm going to pause slightly. I think this mic is quite loud. Yours is not.
Yeah.
Anything we can do to fix this? Maybe we can just a little closer. But it's on and off.
How's that? Better? Cool. Yeah.
Okay. Great. If you're struggling to hear us, please just raise your hand. Okay. We don't want you to struggle. It's hot enough as it is. Cool. Okay, and then how did you reduce the number of mistakes? Can I use a different mic, maybe? And he can use this one.
Is there a problem with this one? Oh, is it mine? Problem.
Great. We apologize for the break in transmission. This was due to ESCOM. Cool. So, over the journey, how did you start reducing the mistakes? Saying the number of wins became more than the number of losses, which is what you want as an entrepreneur.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that there are, of course, some entrepreneurs that get it right first time around and make lots of money. Most entrepreneurs, I guess, like me, make lots of mistakes first and lose lots of money first before you start to make some money. And I think that what happens is that you eventually start to specialize, and there are key things that you identify as being things where you can have biggest impact, or business models that are most conducive to your skill set, your network, your experience, and your ability to influence. And we sort of carry that across as well into businesses that we invest. So there are categories of businesses, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well, but there are businesses that I will never invest in. It doesn't mean that they aren't interesting. It doesn't mean, and for that matter, I wouldn't start a business like that either. It just means I don't understand it. I can't apply models to it that make sense to me. I can't influence the outcomes because I don't have network. I don't have things like that. And I think that it's not a bad thing to start to focus on things that you understand. Now, fair enough, what we've also done and what I've done is start to focus around the technology area, and in certain cases around verticals as well. So one vertical that I'm very passionate about is financial services, and it's partly because I think that it is one of those that is ripe for disruption. I'm not the first person that has ever said that. In fact, I'm, along with Brock, who's on the foundation, the chairman of the Bitcoin Foundation, we believe very strongly that the next major financial services industry that's going to be disrupted is venture capital. It's one of those industries that talks about disrupting, but hasn't been disrupted yet. And I think that, it's really about that. It's so in our case, we've kind of focused around specific uses of technology, and in certain cases, specific industries where I can have biggest impact.
Great. Let's talk about Bitcoin. Yes. We'll start, I think, because there are people here with different levels of understanding of Bitcoin, and some who haven't bought any Bitcoin, with others heavily invested. So let's start from the beginning. What is Bitcoin?
So it's a good question, and there's no easy answer to it, and it depends on when you ask me the question. And the reason for that is that, and it's one of the reasons why the regulators are making such a mess of Bitcoin, is that it isn't anything yet. It's too early to tell. It's a piece of technology. It has certain objectives. In fact, no, that's not even true. It doesn't have any objectives. Different groups of people that are deploying the technology have their own objectives that they apply to the technology, and that kind of is influencing where this technology goes. I think that one of the major advantages and disadvantages of Bitcoin is that the original founder or founders aren't publicly commenting on anything or may not be alive.
I thought you knew Satoshi. Like, yeah, I know him on the Bitcoin.
And I think I know who Satoshi is, but the important thing is that it's not the same as like in a project like Ethereum, where if there is a major dispute, it's there is somebody who, for right or wrong, that will kind of lend themselves as being the person who is most capable of providing guidance. And there is nothing like that in Bitcoin, which is actually, I genuinely believe it was intentional, because Bitcoin by its very nature is completely decentralized and distributed and is owned by nobody. And so what is it trying to be? So it depends on, if you take the approach of what was written in the white paper, so for those of you that don't know the story, basically 2008, the white paper is released, first version of Bitcoin is released. In fact, the white paper was released after the first version, so 2009. Satoshi Nakamoto, a pseudonymous creator, publishes the white paper and the first version of the code, and he says, hey, I'm trying to create this new version of electronic cash, and I solve a very important problem that hasn't been solved before. And it's this idea that in previous incarnations, there had to be a centralized location that establishes trust in the network. So PayPal, for example, there was still a PayPal corporation which had a CEO which made the final decision about what was the product, who was going to use it, who the partners were, key operational aspects. Bitcoin doesn't have any of that. Bitcoin has a pool of contributors. We can talk about whether or not that pool is centralized or not, but the point is that theoretically, and that's already happening, anybody can do anything they want to with Bitcoin. They can fork it, they can contribute to existing implementations of clients. So Bitcoin really is just a piece of technology, and what it initially was created to do is to create a version of electronic cash that enables you to transact between two people without the need for a trusted intermediary. And so it solves something for the very first time called the Byzantine general's problem. And so the Byzantine general problem is really just this idea of how do you coordinate economic activity by laying down rules that anybody can just look at the rules to understand whether or not a transaction is valid. So what Bitcoin Network effectively does is it embeds those rules into the protocol and allows anybody to transfer Bitcoin between two people without anybody else having to get involved in that transaction. Now, when I say anybody, I just mean in terms of approving the transaction. So there is still something called a node, which effectively has to verify that the transaction is valid, and there is a miner who has to include the transaction in the next block of transactions. But for the most part, two people sending value to each other, nobody has the ability to censor that transaction, nobody has the ability to involve themselves in that transaction in any way. So perhaps, how has that evolved? So in its first incarnation, it was a variation on cash. Where we are now is, it is more like a digital commodity. So it is not a particularly good form of cash. Transaction fees are too high. Block confirmation times take 10 minutes. Usually you need sort of 2-3 blocks in order to be safe, that the transaction won't be reversed. So you're kind of looking at about between 10 and 30 minutes before the transaction is absolutely cannot be cancelled or reversed.
Meaning that if I want to buy Castle Light, I need to wait like 30 minutes for them to say, yeah, finally we've agreed, this is what you paid and this has been recorded.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that and again, because there is no central party, and that's a good thing, there is no document that says, this is what Bitcoin is and this is what we must go and achieve. There is no manifesto for Bitcoin. There was a white paper that said, I've created this technology, I think it's going to be useful in the following kinds of ways, but most importantly, it solves this problem which previous versions couldn't solve. So today we have this thing, which is, it works more like a commodity than it works like currency. It's not a particularly good form of cash, so it's a little bit more like digital gold today. And I think that that's not a bad thing, because again, if we look at the philosophy of what was Bitcoin intending to do, and why did it even launch?
So the very first block of Bitcoin that was ever mined has got a reference to the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer about to put new money into the UK financial system because of the financial crisis. And so there is no way that you can separate Bitcoin or the genesis of cryptocurrency from the fact that the financial system may not work. Keynesian economics, which are really just about like this idea that if you want economies to grow, you've got to encourage consumption. It may not be true. It may actually lead to boom and bust cycles. And so what Bitcoin did but once again, as a very novel and new thing, is it said there are 21 million Bitcoins. There will never be more than 21 million Bitcoins issued. And so it creates scarcity, and by its very nature, it's deflationary and will tend to increase in value over time.
Yeah. It sounds like the gold rush, where everybody was going to buy shovels, trying to pan for gold, and they're finding very little, but the people made lots of money with actually the people selling the shovels. Meaning the people who are giving you the machines, the mining, and they're doing the ICOs and all that. Is it similar, or what's your comment on that?
So I've got very mixed feelings about whether or not one should view Bitcoin as an investment or whether or not you should view it as a long-term store of value. And maybe it's the same thing, but right now where we are, like for example today's a great day, is Bitcoin has gone up 30% in one day. And so there is nobody that can tell me that that's driven by utility. That is driven by mania. And so what it is everybody suddenly wants to get a piece of this action because everybody else wants to get a piece of the action. And so you have this virtual cycle that's driving the price up. But I guess the challenge is that, so right now, am I happy about the price of Bitcoin going up? Absolutely. Am I concerned that the same people that are buying on the way up will not sell on the way down or at the bottom? Absolutely. So there is going to be, I strongly believe that as much as, because of the rate of the increase in the price of Bitcoin, not because of the amount. $16,000, $17,000 is an irrelevant number to me. I think that in the long term, a Bitcoin will be worth $100,000, $1 million. It could be worth, we don't know. But the important thing is the rate at which it's accelerating is not reflecting the fact that people are saying, I want to hold value outside of the control of a government. It's people saying, I want to make money as quickly as possible by buying this thing I don't understand. And because my friend next door, my neighbor, or whoever made some money off of it and told me.
Yeah, my Uber driver told me.
Yeah, absolutely. You get all the best tips from bar ladies, actually. So I, fundamentally, I genuinely believe that this is one of those things where, and obviously we've believed this for a long time, that this is a kind of technology which is so fundamental in terms of the way that it's going to change the way we view the world, that it's not going to go away. The idea that it's in a bubble is really reflecting its rate of price increase and the fact that it's not tied to utility, but it doesn't mean anything to me in the long term. So $17,000, if you buy Bitcoin today, and I'm not giving you investment advice, but if you buy Bitcoin today at $17,000 and you hold it for 10 years, I would be very surprised if you lose value. The problem is if you buy it today for $17,000 and you sell it next week for $10,000 because you panic, then you didn't understand the purpose of the technology. It's not about speculative investment. On the other hand, the cool thing about it is that first step is everybody must become aware of it. Then they have to go out and buy it and start to play around with it, and they go, wow, this is kind of cool, kind of new, different, weird. And then they realize, actually, I don't want to buy coffee with this. And the reason why, one of the, I don't know if you want to call it a mistake or an unintentional consequence of it being particularly good store of value at the moment, or investment, I guess if you want to call it that, is that when you look back, you always regret the expenditure that you've made in Bitcoin. So, good example of this, first major transaction on Bitcoin which involved purchasing something, and the story's been told a million times. 2 Papa John pizzas, 10,000 Bitcoins. Work it out. How much did they pay for the 2 pizzas? It's $140 million for 2 pizzas. So, and that principle does not go away. And so there is a whole new interesting areas of research that are going into Bitcoin, which is that when you change the dynamic and you remove inflation, what happens is that people stop spending. And so the biggest Bitcoin holders are the most thrifty people in the world, because they are holding onto those Bitcoins for as long as possible, and then eventually they're just going to retire. And there is no like major expenditure that happens in between. So, you know, it's a very different world that has just started.
Yeah, and I think talking about that, a few people like Ray Dalio, somebody from Bridgewater, I mean the founder of Bridgewater Associates, somebody who didn't lose money in the 2008 crush, says that Bitcoin is a bubble, and a few other people say that. And what's your take? I know you say that it remains volatile, but on the long run, do you think it will continue on this trajectory, or it'll keep bouncing up and down, or it's just going to crash at some point?
So no, I absolutely don't believe. So I think there will be the faster the rate of appreciation in the price of Bitcoin, the more significant the correction will be. So the fact that you have a 30% increase in the value of Bitcoin in one day is dangerous. Does it mean that? So I do think absolutely Bitcoin is in a bubble today. Yes, definitely. But let's put it into context. A lot of people compare it to the tulip mania and they go, oh, this is like buying useless things and then exchanging them because other people are prepared to buy useless things. It sounds a little bit like crypto kitties, actually. But what happened in the tulip bubble actually was that those tulip bulbs had actually been infected with a type of, I think it was a virus or something like that. And so they actually died. You couldn't plant them anymore. You couldn't get flowers out of that process. And so it's a really bad example of Bitcoin is not like that at all. The one thing that I would say Bitcoin is a little bit like is it's probably more like the dot-com bubble. And so what's happening right now is there is a massive amount of irrational exuberance which is driving price movement at the moment. Incidentally, there is also market manipulation that is driving that price movement, but we'll get to that just now as well, maybe. So it's essentially just this, you have the situation where, yes, there was a dot-com crash, but we didn't suddenly stop using the internet. So, you know, yes, of course, there was this real big problem, and like, it was, the internet for all intents and purposes couldn't do all the things that you could do with it today, but what happened is that there was this irrational exuberance on the back of what people thought the technology was going to do. The technology wasn't ready for that. So there was no utility. And then you had these, effectively what happened is the startups ran out of money, they didn't have revenue models, and so you had this crash. But immediately after that, we started building what we can see today as happening on the internet. And so I think we're going to have the same situation here, where yes, there will be corrections, but as long as you do what early Bitcoiners did, if you're going to buy Bitcoin now, hold Bitcoin. There is enough data to suggest that the best investment strategy for Bitcoin is buy and hold. Doesn't matter what happens, hold.
Pretty much like any investment strategy.
Well,
buy and hold, and a lot of people struggle with that because it's difficult. It's easy when you're making money, and then it's difficult to watch your money reduce, even if you know it's going to bounce back.
Well, you don't know that it's going to bounce back.
Then you sell, then it starts to pick up again. Then you buy. You just buy and sell at the wrong time.
Right.
We're going to take questions from the audience. I'm going to need help with the microphone. Great, and then we'll continue with the conversation. Before we do that, can you talk a little bit about blockchain? So now the blockchain technology.
Cool. Right. So Bitcoin is vertically integrated already. It has a protocol and it has an application, and the application is Bitcoin. The underlying protocol is called the blockchain. And so what a blockchain effectively is using this thing that I just described before, which is called a consensus mechanism. And what that consensus mechanism is agreeing up front and publishing what the rules are that govern what is a valid transaction and how to validate and how to append those transactions. So what a blockchain is effectively doing is that when I send 1 Bitcoin to you, I am telling the computers that secure that Bitcoin network that I would like for them to include that transaction in the next block of transactions that they are going to process every 10 minutes. And for doing that, I say to them, I'm prepared to pay you this fee. And then what happens is that the miners on the network, and those are effectively those servers that secure the network and make sure that nobody can reverse the transactions or steal my Bitcoin, they then, these transactions get broadcast to them via the wallets, and they receive these transactions, and they would typically, when the market is working, they would order them according to who's prepared to pay the most to include the transaction in the next block. And so they would order them according to that, and let's say, for example, I said, I'm prepared to pay right now $20 for a transaction, and they would say, okay, $20 sounds like a good amount that I'm prepared to put in, and they would then put it into the next batch. And every miner across the world is doing that at exactly the same time. But the important thing is that they have to then solve, in order for them to claim the reward associated with that, which is 12.5 Bitcoin per block plus transaction fees, they have to solve a very, 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 very difficult mathematical problem, which cannot easily be reverse calculated. And so what it essentially is they have to take guesses. So imagine that I gave you something even more complex than saying to you 564 billion times 7 minus 2 times pi, and this is a really, really, really complicated calculation. I say to you, if you can solve that calculation, then I will give you 12.5 Bitcoin plus transaction fees. And then the miners go off and they do these calculations, but actually because of this mathematical calculation being so complicated, it's actually equivalent, think of it more like a point on a graph. So you have to guess which point on the graph corresponds with the answer to this mathematical problem. And so they make these guesses, and then the difficulty calculation is configured in such a way that every 10 minutes you're expected to figure out what that answer is. And so within those 10 minutes, the first miner that correctly guesses that answer then kind of puts up their hand and says, I've solved it, this is the answer, and then everybody else that says, oh, well, let's check if you got it right, and they go, yes, you got it right, okay, fine, we're allowed to claim the reward. And then they take those batch of transactions and they go, okay, we hash those transactions into a block, and we append that block to the end of all previous blocks, which then forms that chain of blocks. And so every time you add a block to the end of it, because it's referencing all previous blocks, it makes the transactions that were done first more and more secure. So the last block is always the least secure. The very first block, there is no way that you're going to reverse that block, ever. So that's kind of what the blockchain does. Now, what's happened is that that's in a proof of work system. Now, there are alternative implementations of blockchain technology, because some people kind of said, hang on, we kind of like this Bitcoin technology, but we don't like the idea that people out there, maybe even people in China, are deciding on what is a valid transaction and what's not, and including that in the blockchain. And so what we'll do is we'll take the mining function out, and we'll put in what we would call trusted nodes. So, and there are other examples as well, but the easiest example of what financial institutions are working with is this idea that you take the mining function out, and then you create servers that you trust. And so an example in South Africa might be you have 5 banks, and those 5 banks each have a server, and they agree on what those rules are, and then you could create something like RAND on the blockchain, and as long as those 5 servers had those rules and exchanged information with each other, you would have a different kind of system, which is not proof of work, but which would enable them to still agree on what is a valid transaction and share this ledger of transactions. So the blockchain technology is really that technology, and it's becoming, there's so many different implementations of it now, but I think that it's still important to know that this technology is so immature. The fact, for example, that you can take Ethereum down of the CryptoKitty game tells you that this technology is nowhere close to like being used in daily life. This is like, people operate, we're playing in a sandbox here, and occasionally people want to play in that sandbox too, and then it gets kind of like super difficult when they're like, getting frustrated with the fact that the network clogs up and can't process any more transactions. So for example, Bitcoin, 4 transactions per second, that's it. 25,000 transactions per second is what Visa does. So it's not a payment system. Ethereum is at the moment on like 7 transactions per second. So once again, if everybody in the world is breeding cats, Ethereum stops working.
Yeah, great, thanks. Thank you very much. We'll take a question.
Hi, my name is Ian. I'd like to ask a very general question which is really underpinned by some other thoughts that have crossed my mind as you've been talking. The very general question is, where do you see Bitcoin evolving? The other questions that are underpinning that are, what is going to happen? Are governments and banks maybe going to try and gain control? Are other industries going to spring off Bitcoin? In other words, people saying, we'll handle your Bitcoin portfolio for you because you don't really understand it. And will there be things like derivative markets coming off Bitcoin? Another thing is that it's something, as you said, when you ask what is Bitcoin, you answer differently at different times. So really one is trading in something that one doesn't understand and also which has no tangible value. And another question underpinning that is, what happens with...
That sounds like a blockchain kind of question.
Who holds ultimate accountability? So those are just a whole lot of thoughts that I've got in the back of my mind, saying to me, well, where is this going to evolve to?
So the cool thing about the first question in the block, in the chain, is that where it's going is entirely dependent on where the community wants to take it. We don't know. Essentially the way that it works is that you have groups that are working on Bitcoin. Right now Bitcoin is called BTC, and there's a group of contributors called Core, and they have different rights. Some have, more important rights than others, but for the most part, if you wanted to contribute to Bitcoin today, you could write something called a BIP, or Bitcoin Improvement Proposal. You could submit it to Core. You could say, I think that it solves the following problem. This is why it's, would be improvement to Bitcoin. And if everybody agrees, then it would be included in Bitcoin. And that's how it works. And if you don't like the way that Core is taking Bitcoin, then you can take a copy of BTC and you can, call it Bitcoin Cash. And then you can call it Bitcoin Diamond and then Bitcoin Emerald and whatever it is that you want to create. And that's fine. It's okay. Because it means that we all have the ability to decide on where this thing is going to go. So again, if there are a lot of people that are very anti sort of this idea of forking Bitcoin. But if we said, for example, that Bitcoin may only ever just be a really good version of digital gold, and there are lots of people that don't agree with that, but let's just assume for the time being that that is what's going to happen. There isn't anything inherently bad with a different group of people taking that code and deciding that they want to change some of the rules so that it is more conducive to being a form of digital cash. And so, as Sandra has said, one of the things would be you'd have to reduce transaction fees, make it a lot faster to include a transaction into a block, those kinds of things. And so there are people that are working on those things. Where do I think it goes? I don't know. Do I think that Bitcoin will be the only cryptocurrency? No. Do I think that it is going to be the dominant one that underpins most other currencies? Yes, I do think so. I think it will always be a reference chain. I think that the other super interesting thing to your point about will governments do something about it, does it have inherent value? The inherent value one for me is super interesting because it assumes that money has inherent value and it assumes that gold has inherent value. And gold, and then people go, oh, but you can make jewelry with gold. That's true, but it doesn't make up nearly the amount of value that gold is valued at compared to using it as a reserve asset. So really these commodities that we say have inherent value have no value. Not really. They only have value because we decide they have value. If it wasn't very easy to copy seashells or find seashells all over the place, we could decide to go back to seashells and it would be the same thing. So money doesn't have value, gold doesn't have value, Bitcoin doesn't have value. They only have value because we decide they have value. That's where we are. So then, governments. So I think governments haven't taken it seriously up until this point. And towards the end of this year, something interesting started happening where governments, particularly in the US, where the foundation spends most of its time, just because that's where regulators make the most mess, is they've said, wait a minute, we think that this thing is being used for illegal activities, so we need to control it. We need to prevent people from doing illegal things with this thing. And I think that what regulators are starting to understand is that you can't control it. You can't come to me and say stop. You can't go to core and say stop. You can't go to a miner and say stop. It exists. Nobody controls it. It's already out there. It's published. So saying something like it's illegal is like saying the air is illegal. The air doesn't care that you think it's illegal. So you can't stop it. We're past that point already, and the regulators that are most informed about this are aware of that. And so where regulators are now is they're saying, okay, two things. Let's try to prevent it from destabilizing our financial system, which is kind of weird because the financial system is already unstable, and that's why Bitcoin exists. So they're saying, okay, we'll monitor the endpoints. And so where most regulators are focusing their attention at the moment is the on-ramp and off-ramp. So exchanges are typically the biggest, most important reporting entities in the ecosystem. So where you take your rands out and where you put your rands in is where regulators are focusing their attention at the moment. And that's largely so that they want to know, are you circumventing exchange controls? Are you paying taxes? Are you laundering money, financing terrorism, those kinds of things? I do think that you're going to have the next wave is that there are going to be governments that are going to outlaw it completely. And so there are 6 very small countries, which I can't even name offhand, that have made it illegal. In fact, I think Namibia is one of them. And then the others are like in Latin America and some Asian countries. But again, it's one of those things where New York made this mistake. New York imposed something called the bit license, and they said, oh, if you want to trade in bit license in Bitcoin, you have to have this license. And they made it exceptionally hard to get that license. You know what happened? Everybody just moved out of New York. So there's no financial innovation around blockchain that is happening in New York. So Bitcoin doesn't care that New York doesn't want Bitcoin. It just moves everywhere else. And I think that that's kind of what happens. So if we had a situation once again where countries may say Russia, China, which are probably the most likely to ban it first, all that will happen is that it will move underground. People will use it as a way of circumventing around government control. There is no way to stop it, and that's not a bad thing because it exists because we genuinely believe that governments are not good at looking after our money, and Keynesian economics has, to be honest, is just destroyed value. And so this is seeking to create an alternative financial system. It doesn't replace the current financial system. What it does is to say, we want more choice. We want some say over, if government is going to print more money, I want out. And because I can't just hop over the border and live in a different country very easily, or maybe I might even want to, I want the option of saying, I don't trust you with my money, I'm going to put my money somewhere else.
Okay. And our append an answer to that, yes, the Bitcoin futures have started to, regulation now has been given, permission has been given, which opens up a whole new kind of world. Yeah, we have another question, and I know there are lots of questions, so we'll try to keep one question, we'll take one question at a time, and then, yeah, great. Go ahead.
Hi Lou, thanks for coming out. Bit of a fan, quite proud to see a South African doing it in the space. I'm sorry if I missed this, but what is the purpose of the Bitcoin Foundation?
It's a good question, and I think a lot of people don't understand that, and sometimes I don't understand it myself. So I'll tell you where it started, and then I'll explain where we got to. So this technology was released, and Satoshi Nakamoto gave the commit access to Gavin Andreessen, and so Gavin Andreessen was the core maintainer for a long time. And Gavin and a couple of the early Bitcoiners said, maybe we should create a place where we can do two things. Number one is get together and talk about what are we going to do with this technology, and secondly, create a place where we can advocate for the use of this technology. And they created the Bitcoin Foundation. And so that was 2012. It was incorporated in Washington. It was the first Bitcoin or cryptocurrency advocacy and governance platform. But then what became obvious is that it doesn't really make good sense to have a decentralized network that has a single point of failure, because there again, the point that I had early on about nobody controls it, well, theoretically, in the early days, that group of people controlled it. You could go to them and say, I want you to turn off Bitcoin, and theoretically, they could turn off Bitcoin. And so, very early on, these two groups, which there are essentially two main groups in Bitcoin. And the one is Bitcoin should be completely decentralized, no coercion, no attempt to coordinate. It must just happen as it happens. And the other group is like, well, we should get together and talk about what we want to do, because otherwise we're never going to actually deliver a product that meets the requirements of, say, exchanges and wallets and users and things like that. And so when those two groups split, the foundation, effectively, Core was originally also employed. Many of the developers were employed by the foundation in the early days. But when that split happened, Core moved out of effectively the foundation, or any influence. The foundation lost any influence over the development roadmap, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think before that, you could theoretically have gone to the foundation and said, please include this feature, and theoretically, you know, you would have had somebody in the foundation that could listen to you and go, we think it's a good idea or a bad idea. It didn't really work like that, but it didn't make any good sense to have a single organization responsible for Bitcoin. So what the foundation evolved into is an advocacy platform to talk to media, regulators mainly, but also engage with people working on the technology and with people that are active on, say, wallets and exchanges. And so part of it is really just like, how do we create, when somebody says, can I please speak to Bitcoin, and this happens a lot, then there will at least be somewhere where they can go, because that usually means that they don't have information. They don't know what they're doing, and it's dangerous for people like that to be trying to exchange value. So the Bitcoin Foundation today is an advocacy platform, and we spend most of our time talking about Bitcoin, encouraging people to use it responsibly, and speaking to way too many regulators to make sure that we don't do things that are going to prematurely prevent the technology from being used for things like financial inclusion.
Turn to the person next to you and ask them, do you own Bitcoin? No, don't answer that. Cool. There is another question.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Calvin Pillay, and just wanted to ask you, what happens when someone creates a better digital currency? And one more additional question to the blockchain of questions is regarding what happens with the Bitcoin and taxes. Thanks.
So, to answer the first question, what happens when somebody creates a better cryptocurrency? That's okay. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that realistically, there are network effects associated with any kind of cryptocurrency. So, you don't actually have users, that you're less likely to have it accepted at point of sale and things like that. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve with that cryptocurrency. But theoretically, there are already other cryptocurrencies that you could argue have features that are desirable to Bitcoin, but which Bitcoin doesn't have. And one of those really obvious ones is there are currencies that have much better privacy features. And so theoretically, you could argue, well, you know, let's all switch to those currencies. But the reality is that there is a roadmap, there are network effects, and I think that it's not a bad thing. I don't think that there is one, as I said before, I don't think there is one cryptocurrency. It's a little bit like saying, well, why don't we all across the world switch to the US dollar as our only currency? There's no reason to. We have different reasons to use our own currencies, and I think that we can have a similar kind of situation. And also, I think that what happens is that these ideas get shared, and so the features that you find in many of these other currencies, if enough people want them and if they make good sense, will eventually find their way into any other currency as well.
Obviously, the most important question for everyone is, can you recommend 3 or 4 safe wallets, apps that you trust? And also going for the altcoins. Obviously people are going to trade. It's too tempting not to trade. I mean, the market is so volatile, it's unbelievable. I mean, I just saw it now it dropped to $1,000. And so it's unbelievable. But, I mean, the whole fear, those of us who got caught in the dot-com crash, you know, these famous words, this time is different. It's the most painful words in history. So, I mean, definitely it's going to be volatile. So the question is, safe wallets, because obviously they
In other words, can you give financial advice?
So the answer to the first question about can I recommend any answer is no, I can't recommend any. But it doesn't mean that I don't believe that there aren't interesting projects. I just I don't want to offer investment advice. The wallets, right? So definitely there are two really safe ways of storing any crypto. It's paper wallets and it's hardware wallets. And any software-based wallet has got risks. And it's usually the problem there is that you don't control your keys. And so if you don't control your private keys, you don't actually own that Bitcoin or that currency. Let's just be honest. You've given that responsibility to somebody else and you say, please won't you look after this for me? But if you lose them, I basically have very little recourse.
So you're saying so you've got the wallet, but actually print it out on paper, the code?
Yes. So if you, for example, you can go to bitcoin.com, they've got a paper wallet generator, you can create a code that is not published anywhere. You effectively move your Bitcoin into that address. Nobody else has ever seen that address, doesn't know it exists, cannot possibly hack your piece of paper. So, the principle there being air gapping. But if you don't want to go down that road, and then of course you would have to do additional things like keep it in a secure location. But the easiest way, I believe, and many other people believe as well, if you're not holding very large amounts, like if you're not holding tens of millions of dollars, then a hardware wallet like a Trezor or a Ledger is a very good solution.
Sorry,
Trezor, Trezor, and then Ledger, Ledger. They're really good.
Great. How many other questions? Just put up your hands, we'll count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 questions, we'll try to answer 8 questions in 8 minutes. Alright, go ahead.
Okay, so I had 2 questions. Okay, well, first of all, my name is Nadir. So the first question I had was, you mentioned market manipulation earlier, so I wanted to know what is your thoughts on that. I wanted to know what's your thoughts on Bitcoin futures, and is there a way to, like, people die without giving their wallets or their private keys away? Like, doesn't that reduce the number of Bitcoin in circulation, and what can we do about that?
So maybe I'll ask the last question first because it's the quickest. When somebody dies and they don't hand over their private keys, it's gone. It will never be recovered, doesn't matter. All that happens is that effectively the remaining Bitcoins become more valuable. So we're okay with the fact that there are
it's like
Bitcoins
you're drowned with money in your pocket, right? You just died.
Yeah.
Right? Go on. Great, thanks.
So, market manipulation. Wow, now we could really talk about that a lot. Let me tell you, big risk, without getting into too much specifics. There is something called Tethers. And what Tethers are is supposed to be a digital representation of US dollars. And they're used usually in trading to move into and out of positions. And they were created by a company that's affiliated with Bitfinex. And theoretically, they're supposed to be as stable as a US dollar, but a digital representation. But $900 million of these things were created in the last year, and there's enough evidence to suggest that what they're being used for is to do margin trading and pushing up the price of Bitcoin. And it's very dangerous, and there's enough evidence to suggest that every time the Bitcoin price spikes, there are tethers that get printed, and that there's a strong correlation between the increase in tethers and the increase in the price of Bitcoin. So it's very dangerous, and we shouldn't assume that all the increase in the price of Bitcoin is because of people just buying.
Hi Lou, Mark Bryson. I just wanted to get your view on the sort of risk dynamics of Bitcoin. I think I agree 100% with you. There's a lot of value here long term, but lots of hysteria at the moment. A lot of people chasing the herd, and what do you see being the big risk that can pop the bubble the next couple of months, the next couple of years?
So do I think that there's going to be a major correction in Bitcoin in the next couple of months? Definitely. So do I think that if you buy into Bitcoin right now and you're expecting to cash out anytime soon that you're going to be at risk? Absolutely. I think a lot of people are even buying on debt at the moment, and I think it's a nightmare. You're going to lose money that way. If you're buying Bitcoin right now in small amounts that you can afford to lose, and you genuinely saying, I'm going to buy and hold, I think the risk is relatively low.
Yeah, do you see any big catalysts that could actually pop and bring the sentiment down quite quickly?
I think so there are futures that are going live in the US. There are, the one group of futures is Chicago Board of Executives, which is this Sunday, the 10th of December. There's another group of futures, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is going live a week later. And there is enough evidence to suggest that the ability to effectively short the price of Bitcoin will drive the price downwards and correct. Once again, we don't know how far. There's no guarantee that it's going to go there, because there's also a large amount of capital that is flowing into it at the moment. But I think that it's safe to say that there's going to be a pretty significant short-term correction in the price of Bitcoin, but I could be wrong. So.
Continue to tweet. There's a Twitter competition. Remember that.
Hi, my name is Sean. I'd just like to ask if the Bitcoin Foundation and court offenders are aware of potential disruptions, specifically like quantum computers being able to crack the encryption in the next 10 years possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are parts of the Bitcoin protocol that are unaffected by quantum computing. And then there are parts that would be affected by quantum computing, and the principle is kind of like at the point where the risk is deemed significant.
My question is, what would the government do from the technology point of view? What would they develop to actually be able to kind of tax or sort of regulate Bitcoin, apart from telling people not to do it or banning it at all?
What can the government do from a technology perspective to
what
prevent
would
Bitcoin?
they develop as a technology, as a way to actually sort of control what they want to control without telling people not to do it?
So one of the ways that I guess you could do it is if you were in China and you controlled access to the internet. The Bitcoin network is sensitive to access to the network, because if it can't access nodes or miners, then you can't complete transactions. So theoretically, if you cut off internet access, it would make it much harder for the Bitcoin network to work. But it would also make it a lot more difficult to use the internet. So I don't think that there's a good technology solution to what you can do about Bitcoin. Also because it's a decentralized network, so you're not looking for one server or one location that you can take down or block or something like that. So it's very hard to do. And even in China, theoretically, if you could identify the type of traffic, you could identify miners or nodes or something like that. But the reality is, even VPN services still work in China. So the Great Wall of China is not that effective. The Great Firewall of China.
Great, thanks.
Hi,
There's a question here.
Okay. Hi, my name's Greg. So earlier you said that no one really knows where this is going, and we're not really sure what it's going to be used for. Something that I have in mind is, and what excites me about cryptocurrencies is this idea that you can create a currency that can only be used in a particular way. So for example, in South Africa, taxes get misused, as they were this last year. I mean, a fascinating idea to me is an idea of paying in a cryptocurrency that can't actually be misused. And I think what's very exciting about that is it empowers us, it empowers anyone with that cryptocurrency, because they know exactly what it's going to be used for, they know what it can't be used for. Is that a realistic or reasonable vision or idea?
I think it's possible. I guess it's just a question of what time frame. So the analogy for us is we're like in 1993 of the internet now. We have no idea that the reason why we're creating this technology is to look at pictures of cats. So we don't know where this is going. So we've got lots of grand ideas, and I think that again leads to this mania, because there's lots of ideas about all the things that can be done, and we're going to end up doing a quarter of those. And that doesn't mean we need to be negative about it. It just means that we also need to be realistic about where this technology is going to end up, because I think the most important uses of the technology are not when you view the technology isolated from everything else. I think it's when you start to add emerging technologies together. And the example I always use is if you had, for example, blockchain with AI, with the Internet of Things, very interesting things can start to happen. I think that your point about use of blockchain technology, say for example in a crypto version of fiat money, is interesting because that ledger enables transparency and you can see where the money is going. But I really don't like fiat money being issued on a blockchain. And the reason why I don't is because the only countries that are actually trying to do it are the ones that want control. It's not a tool for enabling more transparency around how it's a tool to prevent people from taking money out, and it's a tool from making sure that you can levy any tax and nobody is able to prevent you from taking that money. And there's like a bunch of other things. So I think it's a terrible idea. It's one of those things where the technology could potentially do it in the future, but you shouldn't do it.
Hi, my name is Memory, and I'm really excited that you're here because there's a lot of buzz around Bitcoin, and my friends and I have really been talking a lot about it. And so one of the things that have come up in those discussions, and I read an article about it, is that in the network of Bitcoin, there's a lot of electricity that is being used. Is that true? That's one. And then number two, I just want to understand, like, what does an ideal profile of a Bitcoin customer look like? Like, who is your target? Thanks.
Cool. So to answer the question about how much electricity is the Bitcoin network using at the moment to secure the network, the most recent estimate that I've heard of is that it uses as much electricity as Ireland. So it's a very large amount of electricity. But what we don't have is comparable data. So we don't know how much electricity does Visa use. We don't know how much money is used in enabling the electronic transfer of ZAR or USD or anything like that. So we don't have good data to discuss that with. And I think that there was another article that came out today from the P2P Foundation, which I was a bit disappointed about, and it kind of said, in a world where we're trying to solve climate problems, how can this network, which is essentially for all intents and purposes meaningless to our everyday lives, why is it using so much electricity, and is this contributing to global warming? And I think that the important thing there is that it has different objectives insofar, or maybe it has multiple objectives. And the one is to create a network that is secure and tamper-proof and where you cannot reverse transactions. I do think that there are some challenges with current proof of work in that the network may actually be too secure at the moment. And I think the other thing that we don't have, that we sometimes underestimate, is that mining for Bitcoin is not currently economical unless you can get electricity at less than 3 US cents. So what does that mean? It means you can't use coal, because coal is too expensive as an energy source to be able to mine on, which means that you must look for renewable energy sources in order to mine. Now, of course, there are exceptions, but for the most part, there is a very strong economic reason why you would mine cryptocurrencies on renewable energy sources rather than dirty energy sources. So I think, yes, it does use a lot of electricity. I think that is one of those things that must be worked out. I don't genuinely believe that the Bitcoin network is a leading cause of climate change. So I think we've got some time to go there. What was the second question? Oh, so who's a Bitcoin user? So right now, everybody is a Bitcoin user. My wife showed me yesterday that even like the neighborhood watch group is talking about Bitcoin. So everybody is getting into Bitcoin, which really just tells me that we're sort of already at early majority, heading into late majority, which means that we're very closely getting to a point where everybody will have some Bitcoin. And that's a good thing. So ideal user, I think right now, realistically, to the point that was raised earlier on, is that it's actually quite difficult to secure cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin is one that is maybe a little bit more user-friendly than most others, simply because people have built wallets and applications. So for example, in South Africa, I'm a big fan of Luno. I use Luno myself. I think it's super user-friendly, and it's a good solution for people that are just starting out. But Luno doesn't solve all of once you start to want to do some more advanced stuff, then it's not a solution. And I think that that's okay. I think that if most people today, if my grandmother, for example, wanted to start buying cryptocurrency tokens, I would panic. So, I think that it's okay. And so I think that the first thing, if you want to try this technology and understand it, is buy Bitcoin, buy some Ethereum, hold it, maybe send between friends, get a sense of how does this thing work.
Great. Okay, the last two questions, then we're done. So that one and that one.
Hi, I just had a question if you had an opinion on the two major subreddits, the R Bitcoin and the R BTC, and the amount of censoring that's going on, if there's an opinion, and who drives the narratives for those, because obviously that causes big changes in the market, and just wanted to know if the Bitcoin Foundation has an opinion on that. And just lastly, you mentioned the Tether meltdown that's going to happen soon. Do you think, other than Bitfinex will probably crash or something, some of the other exchanges also trading in Tether, do you think they'll be affected, or do you think they'll survive after a massive Tether crash?
I think that you're right. I think Tethers is a big systemic risk, and I think there are multiple exchanges that will be affected by it. If there's one thing, glimmer of light on that, is that you can't actually redeem a Tether. So you don't have the equivalent of like a run on the bank. I don't think that will actually solve anything, but I do think Tether is a systemic risk for many exchanges. What was the other question?
About the Bitcoin.
Honestly, I don't have an opinion on that, and the reason why is because I think that there is an echo chamber that exists on both of those subreddits, and so it really is just a question of, if you believe certain things about Bitcoin, and then you will go to the one, and if you believe different things, you'll go to the other, and if you find yourself in the wrong one, you will quickly be corrected and have to go to the other one. So there's no doubt that there are two dominant communities in Bitcoin, and those people share completely different views of what Bitcoin should be. And as to, is it censoring, isn't it censoring? I think that people get a little bit too wrapped up in the philosophical discussions, and I'm not sure they're always useful to, like, how do we get this technology used more widely and by the average person?
Great. We'll take the very last question, and while we're doing that, continue to tweet. There is some wonderful gifts that will be given to the best tweet. Yes.
Okay, Tana, yeah. Just want to know what will be the advantages if ICO gets regulated to investors in startups?
So in South Africa, wow, okay, we don't have enough time to talk about ICOs, but really what that is it's like a completely different kind of business model that we really don't have in existence today. And it's this idea that you can create microeconomies around products and services which incentivize people to use your product, and also to a certain extent sort of locks in value. We've done a few of them in Newtown now. We think that they are how all businesses will operate in the future. But I'm not super confident that all of those tokens will survive, simply because you won't get network effects. And so eventually there will be no reason to hold them, and they will just become worthless. In South Africa, you can issue tokens. So I think our regulator has, I'm not sure why, but I think it's good that the regulator has mostly not gotten involved, because I think it's so early, and we've been very fortunate in that there hasn't been much abuse here. I mean, there's been other markets where it's been crazy, like South Korea and China, around people just like writing white paper and selling vaporware. Whereas in South Africa, it just doesn't really happen, and I think that's not a bad thing. So regulators taking a wait-and-see approach, I think, is the right approach. And really, there are two things, and again, we won't get into detail, but the key issues around sort of token issues is that you have token issues that look like securities, like bonds or shares, and you have tokens which fulfill a utility function. And the dominant view at the moment is that if it's a security, you kind of need to have it regulated, and if it's not a security, we don't want it to be regulated.
Great.
Thank you very much, Llew. I think this conversation can go on and on because it can go really deep, but there's been lots of education, and sure that some people say, yeah, I'll do it now, or other people a little bit even more confused, like, oh, okay, I don't know what to do now. But I think the main understanding has been given, which I think is critical, and that's why a lot of people have come here to understand and to hear from you, and you're very knowledgeable on this. So thank you very much. A big hand for Llew.